I'm a Jew from Kentucky, that's what I am. The good Lord foresaw it with his infinite plan.
Shalom, y'all. I'm Rabbi Shania Bromowitz. Welcome to the Bluegrass Schmooze. Don't run to check your calendar. Your ears don't deceive you. It's not Sivan yet, but we have a bonus episode for you today. It's a conversation with Ira Glass, host and producer of This American Life. Ira's coming to Louisville on June 1st to do his show called 7 Things I've Learned, and he spent some time with us ahead of his visit.
This podcast is sponsored by Talkspace. You know when you're really stressed or not feeling so great about your life or about yourself? Talking to someone who understands can really help. But who is that person? How do you find them? Where do you even start? Talkspace. Talkspace makes it easy to get the support you need. With Talkspace, you can go online, answer a few questions about your preferences, and be matched with a therapist. And because you'll meet your therapist online, you don't have to take time off work or arrange childcare. You'll meet on your schedule, wherever you feel most at ease. If you're depressed, stressed, struggling with a relationship, or if you want some counseling for you and your partner, or just need a little extra one-on-one support, Talkspace is here for you. Plus, Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members only pay a $25 copay or less. No insurance, no problem. Now get $80 off of your first month with promo code SPACE80 when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Save $80 with code SPACE80 at Talkspace.com.
Ira Glass is the host and creator of the public radio program This American Life, which is heard each week by over 5 million listeners on public radio stations and as a podcast. Glass began his career as an intern at NPR's radio network headquarters in Washington, D.C., when he was just 19 years old. He put This American Life on the air in 1995. He also served as an editor for the groundbreaking podcasts Serial, S-Town, and Nice White Parents, all of which I am a big fan of. And just want to say I grew up in Evanston, and it's always so great to schmooze with a fellow, I didn't go to Northwestern, but Evanstonian and fellow Chicagoan. Such a comfort, such a joy, and so wonderful again to have you. And Ira, welcome to the schmooze.
Yeah. So nice to be here.
So, Ira, in preparation for meeting with you, I looked at your Wikipedia page a little bit, as one does, and I read what I think, if people didn't already know you were Jewish, the sentence, as a child, Glass wanted to be an astronaut, while his parents hoped he would become a doctor, which I think just speaks to your Jewish in that
yes,
moment.
It very much does.
But when we kibitz with people, when we have the schmooze, we ask them kind of for their Jewish bio, right? Like we read your bio, but if you had a Jewish bio, a bio of your Jewish side, what would that sound like? What would that look like?
I mean, it's really hard to talk about this in this current political and historical moment we're in, because I think that every Jew is having such complicated feelings about their own Jewishness, and the way that people perceive Jews and Judaism has changed so much since the war began between Hamas and Israel. But to answer your question, as a kid, I was raised in a very Jewish community. I was raised, suburban Baltimore has a huge number, hundreds of thousands of Jews. In fact, there's a street, Park Heights Avenue, where there's just a long row of these mega synagogues, these big, big congregations, and signs on the street that say no parking on Sabbath or Jewish holidays. And so I was raised around a lot of Jews, and as somebody who I don't believe in God, I haven't gone to synagogue in years, but I definitely grew up in a very Jewish environment where I was expected to go to Hebrew school, and I went away for one summer to socialist Zionist camp, and got bar mitzvahed.
Yeah.
Which was actually the first big fight I got into ever with my parents, because I did not want to get bar mitzvahed. And we got into one of those conversations where they said, I thought very effectively, we've done all this stuff for you. We don't ask that much of you. So don't do it because you want it. You're going to do it for us. And I actually found that very convincing.
So you mentioned that you don't believe in God. And I also read that on your Wikipedia page. But when you've talked about God in the past, you've talked about how the God you don't believe in is kind of this big daddy in the sky who created the world. And I'm curious that I think a lot of Jews in America have this concept of God that's actually fed to us a lot by Christianity, right? Of like the God in the Sistine Chapel, who's this like old white man in a white loincloth or toga who, you know, operates up above in the heavens. But I'm curious, when you say that you don't believe in God, do you have a conception of like that which is greater than us? Is there an idea there that there could be something bigger, or is it really kind of a full on, no, that doesn't jive with my worldview?
For me, it's a full-on no that makes no sense to me. I don't think that there's some conscious overseer with a consciousness and that is looking out after us and manipulating or perhaps choosing not to manipulate events around the world. To me, I mean, it's funny because this is a kind of thing that you can't argue with other people about and reason your way to some sort of, beating their how they see it. I feel like it's a very emotional thing where like people just kind of add up all the facts and they find themselves on one side of this one or the other. And I definitely find myself on the side of like the universe makes a lot more sense if you don't think that there's a kind of magic man in the sky, like who made it all go and needs praying to and is choosing to intervene or not intervene in big things and small in the world. That said, like my life is filled with very religious people who actually more Christians than Jews, but some Jews whose faith really informs how they live and gives them so much. And when I see that, I feel jealous that I don't have that. Like I know a lot of people who get a lot from their faith. And I think actually one thing that is interesting about doing the news and making stories is that I actually think that like religious people are horribly covered in the news and in movies and TV, and like they're generally portrayed in this kind of cartoonish way that doesn't capture what people who really try to live by either Christian or Jewish principles, like what they're really like and how complicated their views can be and how non-doctrinaire and actually like how many shades of gray so many people see. I mean, obviously there are people who fit the stereotypes, but I think that most people I know who have a lived faith are so different from the portrayals you see. Especially Christians. Like weirdly, I think weirdly in this Christian country, I think Christians get a kind of a worse and more inaccurate portrayal in the press and in movies and in TV.
Right. It's so much more simple and it's so much easier to sort of distill things down into a single story. And just curious, Ira, thinking about, right, particularly This American Life and all the different kind of stories and experiences and personalities that you encounter. What is it like for you to sort of be in that more complex space? And if there are things about your own identity that have been shaken up by encountering people's multitudes and people's complexity?
I mean, honestly, for most of my adult life, I didn't think of myself as being, I didn't think of my Jewishness as being an important part of how I saw myself. I didn't especially surround myself with Jews, like not that I avoided them, but like, you know what I mean? Like it wasn't a part of myself that I gave much thought to. There's a writer named Richard Rodriguez who said like your heritage isn't a suitcase that you can lose at the airport. And I think it's very true. Like I don't have a choice about certain things about myself. Like the way I was raised, I just am culturally Jewish. And so that's in me in the same way that the color of my hair is in me. Do you know what I mean? Like that formed me. But for most of my adult life, I really didn't think about that part of things. But interestingly, like in the last 2 or 3 years, especially, or maybe it's more like 5 or 6 years, I've gotten close to somebody who lives in Israel, and he's one of my best friends. and just traveling to see him and being in Israel a bunch more to see my friend and just being thinking way more in terms of coverage and my job as a reporter about what goes on in Israel and just following it more closely, but just meeting a lot of Israeli Jews has made myself like think about that way more. Like that's really transformed my sense of myself. And for the first time since I was a little kid, I've started to think like, oh yeah, I'm in that group, and saw it as like a thing that's really part of me. But that's very recent, actually. And it's so recent that I've never actually articulated this thought out loud to myself. Like this is actually like, but I realize like you asking this question, I think of myself as much more Jewish now than I did 5 years ago, and it's because of those experiences. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the way we see ourselves is really interesting, right? Like you talked about how kind of your rejection of Judaism as a faith, right, was very much informed by that you added up all these kind of facts in your head and you came to this conclusion. And then for some Jews, after they do that, they still hang out with all their friends from Jewish summer camp and surround themselves with Jews. And like being Jewish can still be very core to one's identity, even as an atheist person. But for you, it wasn't by happenstance, it almost sounds like. But then it sounds like over the past 5 years that, as you said, this self-identification has changed. And so I guess as you think about that and articulate it, does that make you think at all about the way, one of the things I was thinking about is that storytelling is in many ways such a Jewish pursuit, that we just celebrated Passover where we all get together around a table and like tell a story, the same story we've been telling for years and years and years. That like, do you see looking at yourself as a storyteller? Do you see a Jewish influence there? And if so, what does that look like? And how do you feel that has impacted the way that you operate as a storyteller and as a journalist and as a producer?
I mean, I think there's a lot of storytelling that is particularly Jewish. However, I think storytelling is a pan-cultural phenomenon that like every culture has storytelling, and Judaism just happens to be one of the cultures. I don't think that that's an especially Jewish thing. I think that there are incredible storytellers of every faith.
Absolutely.
I think for me, like I was raised in a Jewish environment, and like I think I would say that there are two ways in which I think a very particularly Jewish kind of storytelling like kind of just got into my cells, and one is going to synagogue. The particular synagogue that we went to was a conservative synagogue in Baltimore County called Beth Israel. And the rabbi there was this man named Seymour Esrog, who is like a wonderful public speaker, like wonderful, like the kind of rabbi where the kids stick around for the sermon because the sermon is so entertaining. Like as kids, you would look forward to it. And his sermons were long, like 45 minutes long at least. And he was a really wonderful speaker, and he did a very traditional, like I know now that I'm an adult, like very traditional sort of structure for a sermon where he'd start off very funny. He was very funny, and he would tell stories of like whatever was going on in the news that week, and then he would tie it to whatever something in the Torah, and then he would tell other stories, and just like a really wonderful speaker. And I remember being a kid being like, oh, that's a good job. Like, you know what I mean? Like once a week, get up there, tell your little stories, and the structure of what I came to make as, on This American Life, like the thing that I concluded about making stories, I feel like comes partly from the structure of, like, I didn't think about this consciously, but once I was doing it, like there's a structure to the stories on This American Life that's very particular, and that structure is we just start in on the action, right? And there's sort of anecdote, then there'll be some little anecdote, some little story, and then we tell you, oh, here's a thought that leads to. Here's an interesting thought that leads to. And now here's another little story, and here's a thought that leads to. Well, that somebody pointed out to me a few years ago after I'd been doing it for years. Actually, somebody who was training to be a minister pointed this out. He's like, that is the structure of every sermon ever written. And I think that the reason why that form came to me so easily was because of that. The other way in which I think sort of Jewish culture got into me, particularly Jewish culture, is that I'm old. Okay, so I grew up in the 60s and 70s on the East Coast, and as a Jewish kid in a Jewish community on the East Coast of the United States back in the 60s and 70s, one thing that it was very common, your parents would have like Broadway show albums around the house. And our parents, so all those old classic Broadway shows. And every year Fiddler on the Roof would come through Baltimore, and my mom would take us to see Fiddler on the Roof. And so I saw like Herschel Bernardi as Fiddler on the Roof, and I saw this one and that one. I saw it like every year. So much to the point that like a couple years ago, I went to Fiddler on the Roof. I hadn't seen it since I was 18. And I realized I knew not just the songs, because like we had their albums, so of course I knew the songs, but like dialogue, like people would walk on stage and I would know what they were going to say. Like we saw it that many times. And and I've talked about this publicly before, but it's very much true. Like I was from the time I was a teenager, like really from the time, like it's contiguous, right? Like I was a kid in my parents' house, and then when I'm 19, I started working at NPR. So I'm working at NPR as a teenager, and I'm working on these news shows, and I always had the feeling of like I love working here. I love what I get to do at NPR. But it's like these stories could just feel like more. Like they could just go a little further. They could have a little more feeling to them. And so I sort of invented this style of story that we do on our show, where it's like sort of funny at the beginning, and then as it goes on, it gets sort of like bigger and about darker and bigger things, and the sort of bigger issues underlying things become evident, and then by the end it's sort of melancholic and sad. Well, that's the structure of Fiddler on the Roof, basically. Like that's the structure of every Broadway show that all those Jewish writers made. And like I think that the fact that was kind of in me, and I was like, I want to make something that like just feels like more. And then I made that the other journalists at NPR didn't have an impulse to turn journalism into that, but somehow I did. And I think that that's why.
Many thanks to Ira Glass for schmoozing with us. We'll be back on Rosh Chodesh Sivan. And in the meantime, if you'll be in Louisville on June 1st and want to check out Ira's show, you can find out more at lpm.org/Ira. That's lpm.org/Ira. I'm Rabbi Shani Abramowitz. Thanks for listening to the Bluegrass Schmooze.
The Bluegrass Schmooze is created and produced by Rabbi Shani Abramowitz and me, Rabbi Ben Fried. Our executive producer is Laura Ellis.
Production assistance from Alex Biscardi. Our opening and closing song is Jew from Kentucky, written by Dan Byrne and performed by Dan Byrne and Bridget Caitlin.
Thanks to Knesset Israel Congregation in Louisville and Ohave Zion Synagogue in Lexington for believing in two young rabbis and helping us make this podcast a reality. Our show is made possible by support from the Jewish Heritage Fund. The Bluegrass Schmooze is a part of the Louisville Public Media Podcast Incubator, with support from the Eye Care Institute's Butchertown Clinical Trials.
Find us on Instagram for lots of extra content. We're at Bluegrass Schmooze, or send us an email at schmooze@lpm.org.
To keep in touch and to learn how you can help us continue this work, visit bluegrassschmooze.org.
Forever a Jew with Kentucky, my home. Zach is everybody.